There is power in a union.
I think PAIL it's unique. Our forums are unique. I think we're presenting an alternative forum. Consistently, I don't think anyone else is doing that, unless you count the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette with their expensive Carnegie Museum forums with mainstream speakers. But we're trying always to present something that's not normally available. I wish there were a larger turnout. I wish more people from the labor movement would come, because we have some folks from the labor movement here that probably have a little bit more spunk and a little more fight than most of the mainstream of the labor movement does today. I'd like them to hear that, but be that as it may. We have a long tradition in our country of a militant labor movement. It's certainly kept from people. It's not in the media, it's not covered in university courses and so on. In fact, I hope Al brought, Labor's Untold Story. It's a self-published book on that history, which it's self-published because at that particular time when authors wrote it, no one even wanted to touch the real history of the labor movement in the United States. So if you want to know more about it, that's the book to get. It stands up. It's written, in the early 50s? Probably been revised.
Yeah, we sell it. We print. We're the publisher.
It's self-published by the United Electrical Workers. So
hundreds every year.
You'll not only be learning about the labor movement, you'll be supporting one of the few labor organizations that came out of the 50s with militancy and class struggle as a central part of its approach. So you'll be helping them. But that's a terrific book to read. Our movement goes back, the labor movement goes back, to the beginning of the country, in fact. But as a movement, you have the Molly McGuires, which is an untold story. There's a good movie about it, but they were one of the early incipient union movements, uniting workers in eastern Pennsylvania. And of course, there was always the AFL, which was a craft organization, and intent upon organizing only essentially white people and men and craft workers, almost guild-like in its nature. But that broke open in the 30s with the construction of the CIO. First, it was what was the C4 first? It was the Committee of Industrial Organization, because this was an attempt to organize industrial unions and not craft unions. And so it was met with some hostility by the AFL, but people in the AFL actually came out of it to help form it. It became the Congress of Industrial Organizations afterwards. And that was really the birth in the modern era of militant trade unionism in this country. And again, that's a history that's lost. Not lost. You can dig in you can find academics that wrote books about various aspects of it. But in terms of its impact on this country, in terms of what it meant to people, in terms of how it changed the lives of working people, it's a wonderful story, one that you really ought to visit if you can and learn about. And that continued on. In fact, after the war, United Electrical Workers was the third largest organization in the CIO at that time, 600,000 members, I believe, at that time. And steel workers were part of it. Because you see, that was industrial organization. That was organizing around industries and not around skills and crafts and guild-like structures. It meant that everybody in it stood in the same way, and it had a militant stand against racism, a militant stand for women's rights. If you go through many of the issues that are concerned to people today, it was there in the CIO. It was there, and it was pronounced in the CIO, and its leadership was left and left center. But of course, in the McCarthy era, it was essentially destroyed. In 1945, this World Federation of Trade Unions was created as a world federation. It included the CIO, the British trade union councils, the Soviet trade unions, and so on. It was the largest international federation of trade unions in the world. And with the strength of the CIO, with that international development, international capital went after organized labor, and essentially in the next period destroyed it. I'm sure our discussants today will discuss that more. But we live in the legacy of that destruction. We live at a time when, after, with the exception of a few very noble, my uncle was an organizer, elected official for mine mill and smelters, which was absorbed at one point by the steelworkers. They were a CIO union, a very militant one, but they were essentially destroyed. UE, for example, was raided by IBW, IUE. IUE was created or rated by the AFL-CIO. So the war was against the left in the trade union movement. And today, not only in trade union politics, but in politics in general, because labor is really the heart, and it's always been the heartbeat of any really profound progressive movement. And today we don't really have that, essentially because of that era and the destruction of the militant trade unions. So our topic today is class collaboration versus class struggle unionism. And we have some august speakers. We have Ed Gristar, Al Hart, and Colleen Evans, and our chair is Bob, who will introduce them and kick this discussion off.
Well, thanks. That was a great introduction. We're going to begin with Ed Gristar, who's been a labor and left activist for I don't know how many years, I think since he was born. He was a founder of this class. We're going to give you some literature on Committee on Labor Action Solidarity, Struggle and Solidarity. He's been with SEIU. He's a former district council president, labor council, Butler County. He's just done a ton of things, and I know this is an issue that's near and dear to his heart, and we're going to turn it over to Ed.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Bob and Greg. It was a good introduction. You took some of our fire away from us, but it's a good segue. And one of the things I forgot was I have a nice poster that we had actually at the AFL-CIO convention a couple of years ago, where we were able to get our organization in there, and essentially what it says is, and this is how I think we should approach this. It says, what kind of trade union do workers need today? And below it, there's a quote from Warren Buffett, and says, there's a class war going on. He said, of course. He said, and my class is winning, and that's pretty much it. So that's kind of like what's really the subject of today. And as Greg talked a little bit about the history, I think it's important that we can kind of go a little of the history, and then what I'd like to do is have a discussion about what is it that would characterize an approach that a labor union would take if they were using class struggle tactics and strategy, and maybe have a couple of examples of local issues here, and how would the approach differ if a union was actually a fighting union instead of a union that just sits on its heels and waits for some politician or whatever. And what I was doing before in preparation of this is, if you look at and Greg talked a little bit about it, the organization of the CIO, but I'd like to just go back a few years and into and prior to the formation of the CIO in Western Pennsylvania and throughout the country. There was a major steel strike. It was a 1919 steel strike. And in that 1919 steel strike, it was the incipient organization of that 1919 steel strike was a prelude to the organization of the CIO. And what do I mean by that? Is that organization attempted to organize, or that strike was a reflection of the attempt to unionize workers on a mass production basis. And it ran up against, as Greg was talking about, the craft nature of the AFL. So William Z. Foster was the coordinator of that steel strike in 1919, and he talked about how the AFL, and it's almost, I hate to say it, but it's almost synonymous with today, about how the AFL, which at that time was the official labor movement, openly sabotaged the organization of the 1919 steel strike. And how did they do it? And you could look at similar examples today. Well, the first thing that he talked about was that they organized everybody on craft union basis. And they basically thought that you could unionize the steel industry on that basis, which obviously was a failure, because most of the workers were mass production workers who spoke 15 different languages. And in fact, we have flyers from the 1919 steel strike where the union had to organize the workers with 15, 20 different languages. They had to have different papers. And so you think about it today where there's this idea of racism and immigrants. Most of the people who were organized during the 1919 steel strike were immigrants from Eastern European countries, couldn't speak the language. The union had to go against that, and that was served as the basis of how to fight the company. And then I have the quote here because Foster actually wrote a book about the organizing, and just a couple of quotes, and we'll get it. It says, this attitude against the steel strike was reflected by the 24 cooperating unions, he said. He said, except for 3 or 4 of these lesser organizations, not one of them gave any support worthy of the name. And he talked about that they gave a ridiculous sum of $100 per union to organize hundreds of thousands of workers. And so what he was saying was that he said the real force behind the drive, and again, this is the essence of class struggle unionism, the essence of the organizing of 1919, he says, was 150 organizers plus a whole network of local committees and organizations that were gradually built up out of the membership. And he said the union had to fund themselves because the steel workers, not the steel workers, but the AFL unions gave this piddly amount of money. So he said, how could we literally organize hundreds of thousands of steelworkers who really wanted a union when we'd had no money, we had no organizers? He said, that was what we faced. And he said the organizing crew made up of mainly radical and progressive elements, they were the fighting spirit and that's what served as the basis of the union. Take that today and counterpose that with how the unions are organized today, and you could see that unless you go to the rank and file and you try to talk to them and you honestly explain to them, that's the real source of the power of the union. It's not some lawyer, it's not some business agent, it's not some politician, it's the workers. And that's profoundly what is really lacking today inside labor, and that was the source of the problem back then. So when that organization occurred in 1919, those were the obstacles that they faced, but essentially many of those obstacles are reflections of what's happening today. And he also talked about, and think about this, he said that the AFL wanted to have local strikes. That's all they wanted to do. He says they wanted to organize the steel workers only in Chicago. And he said, how ridiculous could that be when you think that you could organize a massive industry? And he goes in discussing and talking about how that this problem. It says in 1919, again, not only did the AFL refuse to give any financial support and organize, but they also systematically attempted to restrict the organization to a picayune local basis. And he talked about how the Gompers and the rest of the unions said, well, let's just have a strike in Chicago. And then he talked about how in Johnstown the workers were being fired, and when they were being fired, the workers were demanding to go on strike. And the union, this Foster and the organizers had to go to the workers and say, no, you got to maintain your discipline. Everybody has to go on strike together. And he said, and again, it's the same thing today. The power of the workers on a national basis is the only way you can confront the power of corporations and capital. And because he said that what would happen, and you can see this happening again today, he said if you had a little strike in Chicago, he said what ended up happening is the companies then universally would give everybody a raise across the country, and it would destroy the emphasis and the power that the workers had. So those are some of the same kinds of problems that are evident today. And when that steel strike began in 1919, it ultimately ended technically in a failure, meaning that the workers lost the strike. But what it did serve as in this article was it served as the basis for people to understand what was necessary to win the CIO. And so 10 years later, the same reactionary right-wing forces within the labor movement existed. And Foster and the rest of the left and progressives said, we can't organize these workers unless we go on an industrial basis. And they created small left-wing progressive unions that actually won strikes in Western PA. They struck in Ambridge, they struck in National Miners Union around here, and those unions served as the foundation and what was called as the militant minority. And I think what he says here, and I'm going to try to get back to some of these things, where he talks about that the lessons that you have to learn from all this, and the lessons are today. And he said that the power of the union is in the workers, and that you got to stay close to the workers. You have to have an idea of talking to the people, and you have to carry on an honest dialogue with them. And when they organized the CIO, that was the whole essence of it. And these progressive leaders, even though they were a small minority of people, they were able to capture, or they were able to win over the workers. And I think that's the essence of class struggle unionism, is that if you have an honest talk with people and you discuss with them what they face, and you have a dialogue with them, that is the only way you're going to be able to have the foundation to build a real organization that's going to fight. So we go on to talk about what are some of the other examples that had, again, they had the language problem. They had a political problem. And what was the political problem? And he just addresses it in the organization, the CIO, was that you don't tie your kites to any capitalist politician. The workers get together, they decide what their principles are, their workers get together and they say, well, we want an 8-hour day, we want a living wage, we want this, we want that, and we use those demands, take them to the politicians. So there's one thing to have political action, but it's another thing to do it on an independent fashion. And I think that is the key element, rather than today. What do you have today? Everybody's just, the labor movement is the kite of the Democratic Party. Instead of the labor movement fighting, let's say, for single-payer health care and giving hundreds of thousands of dollars to the single-payer movement, which could win a majority of change the balance, the labor movement does nothing for single-payer. They almost do nothing for it. All of those are kind of like a segue to what would it be if you built a real movement. And I kind of go back, another little anecdotal thing is when I first started organizing, and I was probably about 23 or 22 years old, and I started my first job with was 1199, which now doesn't actually exist anymore. But I remember my grandfather, and I told him, I said, I got a job with the union. And he said, union? He said, you mean the CIO? And of course, again, it's like a light went off my head. Well, what's he talking about, CIO? And that's the essence of what people thought labor was. It wasn't, I'm a member of the IBEW, or I'm a member of this union, or I'm a member of this little bricklayers union, and we hate the electricians union, and this union it was a movement. It was an idea that grasped the class basis. And that's the only way labor is going to move forward, is if we are able to instill a higher level of consciousness in the workers. Now, what would that mean, or how would that manifest itself in day-to-day organizing today? If you were, if you had a union today, well, what would it mean? And I have a couple little things I remember about 15, 20 years ago. I wrote up a couple things, and I was the president of the Labor Council, and it says, what are some thoughts about working class consciousness? And it says, one of the, in essence, none of these actually exist in most unions today. It says it means understanding that it's more important to build solidarity among workers in different unions than building an identity with your boss. Take that today in any union today. It's like, well, what do we have in most unions? It's labor management cooperation. We're going to work together with our employer because we're all in the same boat together, which is false. But what we're saying is, if you want class struggle trade unionism, you have to be able to articulate an alternative vision, and you have to be able to talk to the workers. about that. And that's precisely what Foster and these organizers of the CIO were able to do. They, remember, they faced free speech battles right here in Homestead, Munhall, Butler. People were thrown in jail. They weren't allowed to have free speech. And so the organizers said, well, of course workers want a union. How are we able to win that over? And the only way they were able to do that, it says they weren't able to go, and have a talk with the politicians. The workers did it themselves. They went out on the streets and they had free speech fights and they won the right for free speech. Another one is how were things won? Social Security, Medicare, 8-hour workday. They weren't won through politicians. They were won by workers fighting, And it says, understands that uniting workers as classes across occupational, race, and sex lines is important. You don't really have these kinds of talks. And I could give you numerous examples of where workers were able to win fights. And again, has really nothing to do with me, but when I was with SEIU 25 years ago, why was it that the workers, where we negotiated the contracts in Butler County and in Beaver County, why did they have the highest wages and benefits compared to literally the workers in Allegheny County within even our own union? It was because we fought in a different way. And a good example is another quote. It says, it's not that reformists are for reforms, reformists meaning the current leaders of the trade unions, and we're against reforms. It's not like you have to say, oh, we're for revolution. But it says that we are striving for reforms by the way of class struggle, and they want to achieve them by class collaboration. Now, what does that really mean? That means that if you're fighting for the single-payer health care, or if you're fighting for $15 an hour wage, the traditional way to fighting for that would be I'd go to Bob. Bob's my legislative, he's my congressman, he's Mr. Doyle, or this is Mr. Furlow, and we go to them and we say, could you please introduce this bill? And they say, oh yeah, we'll introduce that bill, but Bob, it'll really never pass, but we'll do you a favor. And so Bob then goes back to the workers and said, I just talked to the congressman and he's really with us. And the workers say, well, that's good, he's really with us, and what's he going to do for us? Well, he's going to introduce this bill, and what are we supposed to do? Well, we're supposed to pretty much do nothing. We'll just sit back, and if we elect, it's like Doyle. Doyle says, how are we going to get single payer passed? How are we going to get single payer passed? And so what Congressman Doyle told a couple of the people, they said, you know what you got to do? You just got to elect more Democrats. And one of the women who was a physician said, well, we've been there and done that. We had a majority of Democrats 7 or 8 years ago, and this is what we got today. It's the same thing today. So what's the alternative? The alternative way of struggling for every minimal demand that workers have is you have to go to the workers themselves. You have to talk to them, and you have to say, we need to get our own ranks together. We need to build our own coalitions. We need to fight in our own way. The politicians are still there. We still want to have a dialogue with them. It's not as if we don't recognize them, but we don't rely on them. We don't use them. We fight ourselves. And that's a class struggle union. One part of a class struggle union is mobilizing the members, talking to the members. Over-reliance on legal technicalities is another just dead end today with the unions. It's like, well, what are we going to do? Well, we have an arbitration, and when you look at the history again of labor, the first contract with the auto companies literally was about 2 pages long. It was 2 pages long. And what was it? Workers had the right to strike over grievances. So instead of saying, well, we have this big fancy schmancy lawyer and it takes like 6 or 8 months to go to arbitration, which is today, and the workers just said the hell with the union because it's all tied up in legalities, they would have a discussion with the workers and they would decide, well, it's time to go on strike maybe if they got this gentleman or this lady got fired. Those are the differences. So we have to kind of not recapture that, but we have to consciously understand what it takes to win. And in order to do that, you need to have militant leaders, and they don't, have to be in the majority. What they have to be is they have to be conscious, and they have to be able to win over the rank and file members. Why? Because you have the confidence that what you're proposing is what is needed for the workers. I mean, look at the election today in a couple days ago in England. How could it be that Corbyn was able to capture that mood? How was it in 2016 that all of the labor movement was so behind Hillary Clinton, but they couldn't figure out that the workers weren't there because they had lost touch with what's going on? How could it be that there's a majority of support for single-payer health care, yet it has no political expression? Those are the things that we have to recognize, where our power comes from. As Foster and the CIO, was built, the power comes from the workers. And it doesn't come from lawyers, it doesn't come from politicians, and it comes from struggle. Just a couple, one more example, then I'll move on. Is that a couple of years ago, I had a hospital up in Warren, PA, and the hospital said we're going to privatize and subcontract out all the lab workers. So this is in a small rural hospital, and there was another union that represented the non-professional workers, and I was with the professional workers, the nurses and the lab workers. So they came to us, and it was in the middle of the contract, and they said, you know what, in a couple of months, all the lab tests are going to be outsourced to all over Erie and wherever. We're going to just bring vans in here, and that's going to be the end of it. And they said, you know what we'll do? We'll negotiate with you on your effects, meaning that if the workers lose their job, we'll give them a couple months health care, and we'll be nice to you. So of course the workers were all, they were up in arms. They said, well, what are we going to do? And immediately the other union said, they capitulated. They said, absolutely, they had about 15 or 20 non-professionals in the lab, and they just said, let's just agree to do that. And of course, because of what our union was different, we held a meeting with the workers in a room like this. There was maybe 50 of them. And they were like crying to me. They would say, well, what are we going to do? What alternative do we have? The other union has sold out. The doctors are against everything. We can't do anything yet. So I said, well, look, you have two choices here. And I said, I'll guarantee you one thing. If you do nothing, you're going to lose your jobs. And if you want to do that, that's your decision. But if you want to fight, there's no guarantee we're going to win, but we will organize a fight and we'll do whatever we can to save your jobs. And so they discussed it and they said, well, of course, why wouldn't we fight this? So we organized this fight, and the workers, this was right around the time Wisconsin was going on, and again, when there was this kind of upsurge in Wisconsin, if you remember, where people were fighting they went out into this little town in Warren, PA, and we said, let's collect signatures. They went to the Kmart, and they went to all these places. They got thousands of signatures because we wrote up the petition and said, fight outsourcing, you're going to lose your job, this is privatization of everything. And it was like the community just came and supported these workers. And then we filed the charges and with the labor board. Long story short is that the other union actually went with a full-page ad against us in the newspaper, lining themselves with the hospital, saying that they're ruining the town and everything and da-da-da. We saved those workers' jobs. We saved the jobs of the workers, and that is just a small, anecdotal example of what could happen. And I would go to the other unions, and we would say, well, look, this is what you could be doing if you would fight. Just think if you did this on a national basis. And my other example is the last thing that I did was one of our hospitals here in Western PA, the nurses make high salaries, the highest in Western PA. 20 miles away, the workers were represented by another union who were making literally $8 an hour less. So that union was essentially collecting dues from the workers. And the question was, should our union raid that union and take over relieve them. And the workers said, either you come and organize us and let us join your union, or we're going to go no union. And again, these are just examples of how the union has to maintain a constant discussion and a fighting spirit with the workers, because if you don't do that, you will lose faith in the people. And that's really what class struggle unionism is the foundation, is staying close to the workers, having a talk with them. Don't become separate from them. Have a position of struggle, or organize things on a mass basis. And what does that mean? And I remember in 1975 or whenever it was, Meany was around, and the current president, the Labor Council at that time said, by God, we don't want to have any demonstrations. We'll do everything by sit down, we'll discuss it, and we'll be statesmen, labor statesmen. And of course, the opposite was, well, the only way you're going to get sources of power is you fight on a mass basis. You mobilize the workers, you put a fight out, and you change the balance of power. So when we talk about negotiations and how to win things, the essence of class struggle unionism is assessing the balance of power. The boss has power, the boss has some politicians, the boss has corporations on their side. What's our source of power? And you have to use that in every situation to determine what your tactics are going to be. And the other alternative way of doing it is you say, well, we have a real good lawyer here. He's just graduated from Harvard. He you ought to hear him at the negotiating table. He can really pound his fist real high, and that's going to scare the boss. And of course, most people who are naive, they say, oh yeah, that's really, why? Because it doesn't mean they have to do anything. It means they can just sit back and say, we got this expensive lawyer, he's or she's going to fight the battle for you. Whereas when we would go to the people, you would say, you might have to do something. And a lot of people don't want to do that. They want somebody else to do the fight for them. But if you're honest, you have to, as we said, engage people. So what's the problem today? And then I'm going to end it. I think the problem today is we need to have an honest discussion, and I would say like we're having now, with workers in each union and in each rank and file place, and say, what is it going to take to win? How can we change the balance? How could it be that workers' wages are sinking, yet the labor movement should be in an upsurge, yet it's going downhill? What is it? What's the cause of this? And of course, most of the leaders in the AFL-CIO refuse to have this talk because they're kind of happy with what it is. They'll make a deal with somebody and they'll say, well, that's the best we can get. So I think we are at a crossroads. And, it's like we talk. Do you ever think today, if you said we want Social Security, we want Medicare, we want the 8-hour day, you couldn't win any of those things today under the current situation in the labor movement because they have no fight. And in Beaver County, which is another county that I represented, they couldn't even get workers to man their phone banks last year, which was the first time ever they claimed in history. Workers wouldn't come to phone bank for Hillary Clinton. Now, if that is an objective situation where you can't have that, the logical thing would be, well, we should have a talk about how we're going to change that. But that never occurred, and it isn't occurring, and it isn't going to occur until people like us kind of make the change and connect the dots. So we need to have some kind of organizational basis, and as we need to create some type of a forum or a way where people can link up and have these discussions, and so that it reverberates among broader groups of workers, because that's our only source of power. And I think that people are looking for answers, whether it's voting for Trump, being confused, whether it's the idea that people want single-payer health care, and that seems on all these town hall meetings, that is the biggest issue going on. And why aren't the Democrats and why aren't the unions like pouring money into that to change it? Well, that's the kind of discussion we need to have. So, with that, maybe we can, continue our talk with Al and Colleen and have a discussion. So thank you.
Thank you. That was a great presentation, and I should not have omitted your role in leadership as a Western Pennsylvania Committee for Single Payer. You've done a lot of great work there, and I couldn't agree more with your call for direct action, class action, as opposed to the use of attorneys and consultants. All the unions, that's all you hear. They're hiring lobbyists, and they're going backwards.
And the reason is I hate, you could say they're actually afraid of their own rank and file. They don't want to mobilize the rank and file, because rather than say, God, it would be great if we had 100 workers behind us, they're fearful of those 100 workers because they might lose their job because they're just bureaucrats, not leaders.
And I'd like to say before I introduce Al to share the benefit of his insights, that Labor's Untold Story was the first labor history book I ever read.
Right.
And I'm old enough to remember the days when you could go into the Pitt bookstore and spend a day in there in the labor history section. But it's since been sanitized to all those dirty ideas about labor having a history and class action and being involved in struggles. So we don't want people to know about that.
This is another book that I would suggest. Actually, one of my co-workers took my volume 2. The Cold War Against Labor is really filled with many, anecdotal examples of what happened to destroy the kind of unions we're talking about in the 1950s. It is really, it's really a worthwhile book to get to. So
Al, we'd like to hear what you have to say about what's going on with the labor movement today. I know you have a tremendous history with United Electrical Workers, and as the editor of UE News, you have some insights I'm sure we'll all appreciate.
Okay, thanks. Well, I'm supposed to be talking to you. Okay. We were told that earlier, and I totally forgot. Sorry. Can you hear me, or can the machine hear me? Okay. I'm Al Hart. I've been in UE since 1973. I was hired at the GE plant in Erie, and that's where I got started in the labor movement. I got started in UE, and I've only been in one union for the last 40-some years, UE. So I have a lot of thoughts about what's wrong with the labor movement, what's wrong with the AFL-CIO, but I've lived a sheltered life. I've lived my labor life in the union that is the exception to the rule, and we're pretty proud of the ways in which we're the exception. The issue of class collaboration versus class struggle unionism is something that we in UE have paid a lot of attention to over the years, because our union was nearly destroyed in the 1950s because we stand for class struggle unionism, and because the entire capitalist class and the entire political structure of the country and the majority of the labor movement joined forces to try to erase our union from the face of the earth. And the fact that we survived is a minor miracle. On the subject of books about the Cold War, there is a brand new book just out in the last 2 months, published by Month Review Press, about my local 506 in Erie, written by an old friend of mine, Jim Young, who started doing interviews in the late 70s with some of the old-timers who founded our local, who fought through the 50s against the red baiting attacks and the raids to maintain our union. And it's an amazing book, because if you want to get a close-up view of what particularly the 1950s, and what it was like to be in a town where you're the biggest union in town, but everybody is trying to destroy your union and try to get you to go with a wimpy union, the IUE, which the old-timers in UE called the imitation UE, and they prevailed over that. So I highly recommend you get a hold of this book if you want to know more about, because this is the most detailed study I've ever seen in one place, in one town, in one plant. What did the Cold War look like? And this is a case of rarity, because we lost most of our members in the 50s. Let's be frank about it. We started out with 600,000 members. By the end of the 50s, we had 90,000 members. We have considerably less than that today because of deindustrialization. But they were very effective, and they thought they were going to wipe us out, and they didn't. To bring it up to the present for a moment, this issue of the class struggle, I think that, to me, one of the most telling things about the state of the American labor movement is that the labor leadership in this country can't even say the words working class. If you listen to the rhetoric of our labor leadership, sometimes they say working families, which sounds like they're in favor of child labor. And the rest of the time, they say middle class. I've attended some of the rallies. There haven't been any for a while. I guess they've given up. And this is nothing against Ed, because despite your affiliation with SEIU, but SEIU here in Pittsburgh had this campaign to organize UPMC. And they had a bunch of rallies and a bunch of events, and I hardly ever saw any rank and file UPMC workers at these events. But I remember hearing a major leader of the SEIU here locally speak at a rally, and he must have said the word middle class 20 times. And now, first of all, I don't believe class is defined by income. A worker making, $100,000 a year is still a worker. A worker making $20,000 a year is still a worker. But even if you go by the definition of income, it's hard to define an $8 an hour orderly as middle class. But the officials of a lot of our unions definitely are middle class. They're upper middle class. And so when they say middle class, we're fighting for the middle class, maybe they're being honest. Maybe they're fighting for themselves.
I think that's what it is.
The other very telling moment for the labor movement in this country was last year, and it was mentioned briefly earlier. We had a candidate running for president, not a Democrat, but running in the Democratic Party, a guy with a lifelong history of fighting for labor, the most progressive candidate the Democratic Party has seen in at least 80 years. He has his shortcomings, that's for sure, and we could all talk about his shortcomings for a while. But this guy was a dream candidate for the labor movement. And most of the labor leadership in this country supported the corporate, imperialist, free trader, Hillary Clinton, and put their staff and their resources and their money into defeating Bernie Sanders and nominating Hillary Clinton because, wait, they had a good reason. She is more electable. Remember how she got elected? This is a sad commentary on the state of the American labor movement, the thinking of our leadership, the fact that they couldn't get their members mobilized and enthusiastic about Hillary Clinton. They still don't get it. They still haven't grasped what their members are telling them by sitting on their hands and refusing to go out and bust their hump for Hillary Clinton. So we have a lot of work to do. But there are bright spots, and there are good things that are happening in the labor movement, and we can get into some of that later. I'll give you one example from our union just to start out, just to sort of this is another thing that I think contrasts the state of the labor and the different positions in the labor movement, or where we stand. 2008, the economy crashes. The greed of the Wall Street bankers finally caught up with them and everybody else. Everything goes to hell. It's a depression. It's a Wall Street crash. The government steps in. Barack Obama, who's still a candidate, leads the charge to bail out the banks, right? So before the election happens, the banks are bailed out. They had to vote on it twice to get it through, but they get a bipartisan bill through Congress to bail out the banks with no real conditions. Nobody ever bailed out the homeowners who were losing their homes, but they bailed out the banks. So Obama gets elected. In December of 2008, month after the election, our members at a plant in Chicago, Republic Windows and Doors, are notified by the company that in 3 days they're going to lose their jobs. They're closing the plant. 3 days notice, which is actually illegal. You're supposed to give 60 days notice. The workers discuss among themselves, we're not going to put up with this. On the day that's supposed to be their last day of work, they refuse to leave. They occupied the factory for 6 days. It became a national sensation. All of the media covered it. Fox News covered it favorably. And most of these workers were undocumented immigrants. And nobody ever brought up the fact, these people are criminals, they're illegal aliens. Not even Fox said that. Those workers captured the mood of the country. The slogan because they found that they were being closed because of the stupidity and greed of the owner of the company, but also because Bank of America, which had just received, billions of dollars in bailout money from us, the taxpayers, had cut off credit to the company. So we made them, or the workers in that struggle, made Bank of America a target of that fight. And the whole Chicago labor movement basically was picketing Bank of America. There were demonstrations erupting spontaneously across the country. We know about a lot of them, but we probably don't know about half of them, where people were going to Bank of America branches and demonstrating, sitting in the lobby. I mean, all kinds of stuff was going on. And the slogan that our members hatched, which became the slogan of Occupy Wall Street a couple of years later, was, they directed this at Bank of America, you got bailed out, we got sold out. And if you remember, Occupy Wall Street said, banks got bailed out, we got sold out. That slogan came from the workers at Republic Windows and Doors in Chicago. After 6 days, they won, they forced Bank of America to the table. At first, Bank of America said, this is not our problem, but the publicity got so bad, they finally came to the table. And they agreed to put up a huge amount of money to pay the workers the back pay they were owed, to make up the WARN notice money they should have got. You're supposed to get paid for 60 days, once either still working or just get the check. Once they decide to close your plant, they paid them that. And not only that, but they got the plant to reopen. This was a big surprise. Another company came in and was, because they saw the publicity, bought the plant. And it's a longer story. The plant didn't last too much longer under the new owner, but it was a huge victory. And we were hoping in UE, a lot of times we're the only union doing something, or we're the first union doing something. We always want someone to imitate us. Please, do what we just did. Because there were plants being closed all over the country during the Great Recession in 2008 and 2009. Wouldn't it be great if Richard Trumka would announce that the AFL-CIO is going to pick one shop anywhere from any AFL-CIO union in the country where the same sort of thing is going on, and we're going to pour all the resources of the AFL-CIO into winning that fight. Wouldn't that be great? It would be great. It never happened. Nobody else did what we did. Nobody else occupied a factory. Nobody else put the bankers on trial. After we won that fight, we had a national speaking tour of some of our members. We sent them on the road, and we had events all over the country, putting together, audiences with the help of other unions to tell the story, because it's a hell of a story, and it had a big impact, at least at that moment. Unfortunately, the impact didn't really last because nobody else picked up the gauntlet. But we had an event here in Pittsburgh at the Steelworkers, which was very surprising because the Steelworkers, who were central to kicking UE out of the CIO in 1949. The president of the CIO was Philip Murray, who was the president of the Steelworkers, when UE was booted out as communists. They let us have this event, and they were there. And Jack Shea, that great militant labor firebrand, Jack Shea spoke. And this comment stuck in my mind. I remember it word for word because it almost knocked me over. An official of the Steelworkers, I won't say his name, it wasn't Leo Gerard, but it was a high officer of the Steelworkers, gives a little remark in support of us, welcoming us and stuff. In the course of his speech, he throws in this little line that just knocked me for a loop. He said, "Of course we all believe in capitalism." Now the reason we're here is because UE doesn't believe in capitalism, because we broke the law and violated the property rights of a company and occupied a factory, which is against the law. It's against federal law, it's against state law, it's against every law you can think of. We don't respect property rights. We didn't respect property rights. We took on an illegal fight. We won the fight. We won the fight because we don't believe in capitalism. For an official of the Steelworkers to say that, I thought about this a lot. What it's saying is, anyone from the FBI that's watching this, we want you to know that the Steelworkers have not become the UE. Even though we're having them here, we still believe in capitalism. The other thing I would have liked to have asked him is, look at all these closed steel mills or places where steel mills used to be in the Mon Valley. How's capitalism working for you guys? It hasn't worked too well for anybody in the working class. So how much time I got left here? Huh? Okay. UE, I got a few things to pass out here. I'm the editor of the UE News. I started out in Erie as a worker. In 1986, I became a field organizer. I worked in several states, Connecticut and Ohio and Indiana and West Virginia. And then in 2006, I became editor of the paper of the UE News. So I brought some copies of the current issue of the UE News. We'll pass them out later. I also brought the issue from a couple of years ago. This is or a year and a half ago, reporting on our last convention, just to give you an idea of how the policies of our union are set by the delegates to our convention. They're not set by the officers just acting by fiat. So these will give you some idea how our union operates and how we struggle day to day. And I want to pass out right now, if someone could help me out, this is kind of our guiding principles here. This is the preamble to our Constitution, adopted at our first convention in 1936. Now, UE's uniqueness in part is how we were formed. The steelworker, I like to compare us to the steelworkers, if that's, people don't mind me bringing that up. The UE and the steelworkers are both CIO unions. We were both formed in the 1930s, but through this upsurge called the CIO. The CIO started when, and Greg sort of mentioned this, there were some AFL unions that were industrial unions that did organize everybody in the industry, not just one craft. The mine workers were one of them. The two garment unions, the Amalgamated Clothing Workers and the International Aid Garment Workers Union, were both industrial unions, and there were a couple others. They decided these workers in the auto industry and the steel industry and the electrical industry and the tire industry are clamoring for unionism. Craft unionism will not work. We learned in 1919 that it doesn't work. You can't carve up the people in the steel mill into 15 different unions. It didn't work in 1919, it's not going to work now. We need to form industrial unions for these workers in these mass production industries. They formed the Committee on Industrial Organization. The CIO said, the AFL said you can't do that. They kicked them all out. So then they said, okay, now we're a competing labor federation, the CIO. And they started chartering new unions. Now, the Steelworkers Organizing Committee was formed from the top down. It wasn't a union of workers that came to the CIO and said, we want to be chartered as a union of your federation. The mine workers, because of the intimate connection between the mine industry, the coal industry, and the steel industry, set up the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, placed a vice president of the mine workers, Philip Murray, as head of it, hired a bunch of organizers, a lot of them communists, and then fired them a few years later because, okay, now that they've done their work to bring members in, now let's get these Reds the hell out of here. And it wasn't until, I think it was 5 years after the Steelworkers Organizing Committee was started, that it became the United Steelworkers Union. So it wasn't a union, it was a missionary project of the mine workers. So it was, from the beginning, it was set up from the top down. And the steelworkers still, and I could go into some explanation of how the steelworkers still show this kind of top-down structure that they inherited from the way they were organized. UE, on the other hand, our founding convention was 19 local unions that already existed, people who had organized themselves, although most of them didn't have contracts, a couple of them did, came together in Buffalo, New York in March 1936 in the middle of a snowstorm, which if you've ever been to Buffalo during a snowstorm, that means you're going to get a lot of snow, and started their own union. The auto workers was pretty much started the same way. There were people already in the auto plants, already had some kind of unions. Some of them were in the TUL Auto Workers Union, the AW. Some of them were independents, and they came together. The same thing with UE. People had already started organizing. They came together. They formed a national union. Nobody funded it. Nobody funded UE. It was very different from what happened in 1919. We weren't waiting for somebody else to give us money to organize. People just went out and started doing it themselves, scraping up their own money to pay dues, to hire organizers. But most of the organizing wasn't done by paid organizers. It was done by people in the shops. And that includes my local in Erie, which, had the book describes the process by which they went from starting from scratch with 50 members to organizing this plant of thousands. So that affects the way the unions, kind of affects the future of the union. If it's organized from the top down, it tends to have a top-down structure. If it's organized from the bottom up, there's a greater chance it'll be a democratic, member-controlled structure. The structure of UE, which is preamble, which is kind of our sacred scripture in our union, this preamble, which goes back a long ways, we have never changed it, and we adhere to it very strictly. Among some of the things in this that are very important to us is it rejects craft unionism. It says it doesn't work. This first paragraph, sentence of the second paragraph, and it says we organize all workers on an industrial basis. It's an industrial union, regardless of, and this is something that really is important to us, all the things that it's regardless of: craft, sex, nationality, race, creed, political beliefs. And that one became a major battle issue in dispute in the 1950s when all the other unions were saying, we're kicking out all the communists from our unions. And UE was essentially driven out of the labor movement because we wouldn't kick communists out of our union. So that in itself made us pariahs. If you won't kick communists out, you must be communists. Well, some of us are, but not all of us. But those of us who aren't don't believe in kicking people out because of their politics. When those people are the most militant people that helped build the union. And the words aggressive struggle, this doesn't really say class struggle, but it says aggressive struggle, and that's what we mean by it. That's what we always meant by it. Against the organized forces of the employers. That means the capitalist class. So this is our founding document that we have adhered to, and we reprint this thing all the time. We do have workshops at, every few years at our regional meetings. So we'll have a workshop about this preamble and what does it mean, so that our members and new generations of our members coming in understand people in 1936 thought these words were very important. These distinguished us from other unions. It distinguished us from people that don't have a union. And, we adhere to these because they have stood the test of time, and it makes a lot of sense. So what does this mean in the way our union is structured and the way we operate? What does it mean to say we're a class struggle union, and the term we use is a rank and file union? Locals have autonomy. The national union doesn't run the locals. The national staff doesn't run the local unions. And generally, we allow workers to have a local in each workplace. Some of our locals are amalgamated locals covering multiple workplaces, but we don't set up gigantic statewide or three-state local unions of 50,000 members where there's no way anyone could ever, any individual or any group of workers could ever run for president of that local and defeat the incumbents, because there's a huge political machine that you're up against. We believe people should have democracy in their own workplace, including having their own local union. As I said, the conventions set our policy. We elect delegates to our conventions. The conventions are the decision-making body. The staff doesn't run the convention. Our conventions are very much run by the rank and file members. We have a policy in our union we've had from the beginning. It's in our Constitution that no officer or staff member of our union shall make more money than the highest paid worker in our industry. So our officers are in the range of $50,000 to $60,000 a year. We're the lowest paid officers of any union in the country, have the lowest paid staff, maybe not the lowest paid staff, but relatively low compared to other unions. Nobody's making six-figure salaries working for UE. And that's because, that goes back to a lot of things. It goes back to the policy of the Bolshevik Party, I think, about what people were paid. But it goes back to the idea that if you're paid what the boss is paid, you're going to start thinking like a boss. If you're paid what the workers are paid, and you have to worry of the same worries about paying your bills that the workers have, then you more understand the need to fight for every dime at the bargaining table, because your fate and your life and that of the workers are the same. And that's always been very important in our union. One international rep from this area, who's now deceased, African-American, very great leader in our union, a guy named Mel Womack, had a great way of describing this particular principle of UE. Why do we pay our officers less than other unions? His explanation was, it's based on the principle that a fat dog will not hunt. If you overfeed your hunting dog, don't expect him to chase rabbits. We have it in our Constitution. There's a line in our Constitution that says, no representative of the United Electrical Radio Machine Workers of America shall negotiate alone with the employer. That's a one little sentence in the Constitution. It's very important because union leaders meeting privately with the boss to cut a deal has been a dangerous situation from the beginning, and we don't allow it. And that's another way to prevent, a lot of bad things from happening in the union.
We'd always have, the negotiations, I'm sure you'd have the boss would negotiate the contracts, and the boss would say, why don't you just come out in the hallway with me, Ed? And I'd always say,
Yeah.
no, I can't do that. You have to take the negotiating team with us. Oh, well, we can't do that,
Right.
So-
Why don't we go out and play golf?
Right.
We'll work it out over over a game of golf, or over dinner. I'll
Right.
pay, The one time the company is generous
Right.
is when they're bribing union officials. Another thing that we still have in one of our contracts, the most important of our contracts, the GE contract, originally we had it in every contract, but over the course of the 50s, when we were fighting for our lives, we lost some of this stuff, the right to strike on grievances. And I worked under the GE contract, and I don't know how many strikes we had in Erie while I worked there, quite a few. None of them I never lived through a contract strike. When I worked there, we settled all the contracts without a strike, but we had plenty of strikes over grievances. Some of them were 5 minutes long,
Right.
some of them were 5 days long, some of them were weeks long. But it's a great weapon to have. And even in contracts where we don't have the right to strike, we strongly urge our members, don't take grievances to arbitration unless you have to, and unless you have a good chance of winning. And we tell people, arbitration is a stacked process, it's stacked against you. Unions lose far more often than they win in arbitration. Arbitrators are bourgeois people that are biased in favor of the company. It's if you win there, you're winning against the odds. And also on the subject of lawyers that you brought up, we don't have lawyers negotiate our contracts. We have lawyers, we don't let them do a whole lot. They can't run for office in the union. There's a lot of unions have, the president of the union is the former general counsel. That wouldn't happen in UE. And by the way, the IWW in their constitution prohibited lawyers from being members, and the Knights of Labor prohibited lawyers from being members. So there's another tradition in the labor movement of not trusting lawyers, alongside this tradition of thinking lawyers are our saviors. Well, we're in the camp of they're not our saviors. There's good lawyers. We've always had good lawyers work for us, but they know their role. To go back to the Republic Windows and Doors case, because our president at the time said this, when we got word from the folks in Chicago that they were thinking of occupying the factory, he said, the one thing I didn't do is go talk to our lawyers about it. Because their job is to tell you, it's illegal, don't do it. Where we're going to do something that's illegal, we do it, and then tell the lawyers, keep us out of trouble, or get us out of trouble. But we already did it, so don't try to talk us out of it. And I remember going to a Labor Notes conference, and Jane Slaughter, the former editor of Labor Notes, commented, no other union in this country would allow their members to do what the workers at Republic Windows and Doors did. And I think she's right. But part of the reason is, every other union probably, the national president would go running to his general counsel and say, can we do this? And the lawyer would say, no, you can't do it, it's against the law. Well, fuck the law. And sometimes unions at their best have done that. I mean, if you remember, you probably don't remember, but some of you might remember, the Pittston strike by the mine workers. When Richard Trumka was president of the mine workers, he was a different person than he is today. And this was in the late 80s. And they had a strike against Pittston Coal Company, which was outside of the general agreement they had with most of the mine operators. This was a rogue company that was out to bust the union. And the union decided in advance, we are not going to win this strike without breaking the law. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take all of our money, because we're an international union, we have some locals in Canada, we're going to put all the money of the United Mine Workers Union in Canadian banks so that American judges can't seize it as penalties for us violating injunctions. And that's what happened. There were judges in Virginia imposing these ridiculous fines on the union, and the union didn't pay them. And if the money had been in American banks, the judge could have seized the union's money. But an American judge cannot seize money in a Canadian bank. So that was the one time in Richard Trumka's life when he understood that this is a class struggle, that these people are enemies, the laws are written by them, for them, and we got to figure out how to violate the law when necessary in order to beat them through the struggle and the activity of the workers. And that's a lesson that sometimes even people like Rich Trumka know that,
Sometimes.
and then they forget it, or they decide to forget it. So I could talk a little bit more about our whole struggle, how we struggle for contracts and everything else, but let me talk about politics a little bit. UE has always preached political independence. We do not support any political party. We are not tied to any political party. We don't give money to candidates. We don't have a political action fund. A couple of our locals have political action funds and give a little bit to local candidates they support. The number of people we've endorsed for President of the United States, I can count them on one hand. In this endorsed Ralph Nader for president. And last year we endorsed, the first time we ever endorsed in primaries, because it was the only way to help him, we endorsed Bernie Sanders for president. That's it. In this century, we never endorsed anybody named Clinton for anything. We never endorsed anybody named Obama for anything. We never endorsed anybody named Mondale for anything. I mean, we have a pretty sparse record of supporting presidential candidates, because our feeling is, if you aren't good enough that we're proud to say that you agree with us on most of the issues, we're not going to support you just because you're the lesser evil. We often urge our members, vote for the lesser evil, but we're not going to endorse the bastard because he's still evil. Obama may be better than John McCain, and we don't want John McCain in there. We don't want Romney in there, but we're not going to put, as a friend of mine who used to be our political action director said, we're not going to put a union label on a politician who's not pro-union, just because their opponent is more anti-union than they are. So those are things that we've always thought are important. Another thing we've always thought important, and this really makes us unique, and this really is part of the reason we were persecuted so heavily, is we believe labor should have its own foreign policy. And we think that most of the labor movement has always, most of the labor movement we know today has always just followed the capitalists' foreign policy. We're at war in Vietnam, okay, we're for the war in Vietnam. We're at war in Central America, we're for the United States overcoming these terrible insurgencies. We want to overthrow the government of Chile because it's controlled by a pro-labor socialist. How can we help you overthrow the government of Chile because it's controlled by a pro-labor socialist? And throughout history, and I have one other hand that I want to give you when I finish here, is a thing I put together a few years ago for our young activist program in our union to introduce our younger members to our history of positions against one war after another. Korea, Vietnam, the Reagan's wars in Central America, and why we opposed these various wars. We took a lot of flack for each one of these things. The most recent thing where we stuck our neck out and are proud of it was at our last convention in 2015. We became the first national union to call for endorse the BDS movement against Israel, and to lay out a position that Israel was founded on ethnic cleansing, it was founding on theft of another people's country, and this cannot stand, and this needs to change. And we paid the price for that. We got a lot of flack. We had an Israeli law firm that's tied to the Mossad bring a lawsuit against us with the National Labor Relations Board, which we won. And even, the first thing this law firm did was they wrote a letter. We just signed a contract with GE in 2015. We just signed another 4-year contract with GE. They wrote a letter to the CEO of General Electric. I have the letter with me. Telling them, basically threatening GE, telling them that we're anti-Semitic, the union, and that if they don't, basically telling them they have to break their contract with UE and refuse to negotiate with the union. I mean, unbelievable. So, and then we got all kinds of hate mail and other shit, but that's, compared to what our union went through in the 50s, that was relatively minor. But it just shows that, and we're the only national union that ever did that. There were some other local unions that did that and then faced repression from their nationals. The most interesting case was that later that year, the Connecticut AFL-CIO, the state federation, endorsed BDS. And the national AFL-CIO came down on them like a ton of bricks. And they're still kind of resisting. And we were very proud of that because we know, actually, their resolutions sounded almost like ours. I mean, they even copied our title. So we were very happy to, whenever we can get whenever somebody else in the labor movement imitates these, gutsy things that we do, we're like, good, hope we're starting a trend. And
the idea that the AFL, supports it was called in the old days, American Institute for Free Labor Development, which is funded by the CIA, funded by the State Department, created fake unions in these countries that Al was talking about, literally. I mean, it's not that they just passed a resolution, but they literally created fake company-oriented unions in Nicaragua, El Salvador, to compete against the legitimate unions of these other countries because their politics, and that's the insidious nature of the whole, it's so rotten.
Well, they even did that in Europe right after the war.
And after the war,
they set up these free unions in
right.
France and Italy and other countries because the mass unions that
Right.
people belonged to were left-wing unions.
Right.
And so the AFL-CIO, or the AFL at the time, it wasn't the AFL-CIO yet, and the CIO had a good position for a while, helped our government set up competing unions in Europe, and then they've been doing it ever since in the third world.
In the late 40s, you're saying?
In the late 40s and the 50s.
Especially
and then
in France, they broke the dock worker strike in Marseille, and because of just what we're saying. And in Italy, they did this. They set up these unions to compete, to confuse the workers, disorient them. And that was the role of the CIA and, unfortunately, the leaders of the top AFL.
there were a lot of pamphlets published in 1973 after the overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile, with the help of the AFL-CIO, or as people then started calling them, the AFL-CIA.
They've now changed their name. Instead of American Institute for Free Labor Development, I think it's called the Solidarity Center, but they still receive money from the State Department and to fund them. So if you go and say, how much money does the Solidarity Center of the AFL-CIO receive from the U.S. government, you'll find that it is a substantial part of their budget, which you have to say, well, what role, why would they do this?
And here's the irony of the situation. Name a major advanced capitalist country that has a weaker labor movement than the United States. And yet this pathetic excuse for a labor movement sets itself up as, we're the role model. You need to do what we're doing. It's working so well. Do what we're doing, and we'll pay you to do it. I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, the French, the CGT, or the Italian labor, they should be going around showing people how to set up unions. But actually, no, they shouldn't. Let workers set up their own unions and support them. That's what solidarity is. It's not, we're going to go in there and make sure you follow our country's foreign policy, and we'll show you how to run a union the way we do it, even though we're pretty much failures at it. So this is, part of what we're up against. I guess I should wrap up here because I've talked too long. Let me just say, and maybe we can talk about this a little more later. In my opinion, I think, I'd say in the opinion of our union, the last crucial crossroads on this question of class struggle unionism or class collaboration unionism was the years 1945 to 1950. That was a real watershed period for American labor, where we could have gone one way or the other. And unfortunately, we ended up on the wrong path. That started out at the end of the war, the biggest strike wave in American history in 1946. Workers went on strike by the millions to recover the money they didn't make during the war, when there was basically wage controls on and a strike, a no strike pledge. The UE, the steel workers, and the auto workers went on strike together against those three industries and won the biggest percentage raises workers have ever received. And there were hundreds of other strikes that year. When the GE strike, when the big three strikes ended, the auto, steel, and electrical strikes ended, like a month or so after that, the CEO of the General Electric Company, Charles E. Wilson, made this statement: the problems of America can be summed up in two words: Russia abroad, labor at home. Now this was a very important statement. This was the declaration of war on the working class, using the Cold War as the pretext. He said it, and that's what they did for the next decade and a half, or really what they've been doing ever since, really. Later that year, this is 1946, later that year, running against the CIO, running basically on a platform of red-baiting the CIO, the Republicans won control of Congress for the first time since before 1932. They immediately went to work on a bill written for them by corporate lobbyists that became known as the Taft-Hartley Act, which rolled back the pro-labor legislation that we got in the 1930s, the Wagner Act, severely limited that, put all kinds of restrictions on unions, and opened the door to the union busting that we see today, to the things that go on today when workers try to organize a union in a factory, and their chances of succeeding are about this much, very much stacked against them. That goes back to the Taft-Hartley Act. The Taft-Hartley Act created all kinds of advantages for employers, and we've never been able to get rid of it.
And in the auto workers, in that period, there was a massive support for National Health Service. And the AFL-CIO, actually not the AFL, but the CIO was for not single-payer health care, but they were for actually a national health service.
Right.
But when this McCarthyist mentality started to come down, the auto workers union, and this is a dirty little secret, they negotiated a contract that eschewed fighting. The deal was, we won't fight for a national health service in the U.S. We'll take insurance coverage for our members. And that kaput the idea of national health service, because the company said, this is what we want. We'll give you insurance for your workers. We'll give you a pension. So not only did they get a pension, but the idea of workers having a general pension that is high for everybody was then negotiated, had to be negotiated on an individual union basis, and that was where we're left with today.
Right, because the unions then, there was almost universal support in the labor movement.
Right.
Immediately after the war, there was actually a bill called the Wagner-Murray-Dingle Act,
exactly.
which would have expanded Social Security to cover everybody, increased the benefits, so you could retire on Social Security alone. The union members did not trust the private market. They would live through the Depression. They didn't trust their own employers. They didn't want a pension and health care from their employer.
Right.
That was a social right. They wanted the government to provide health care and retirement through Social Security and a national health service. The unions were picked off, well, they went along with it, the steel workers as well, and they got unions one by one. No, we'll negotiate this at the bargaining table. It'll only apply to your members. So that even at the kind of what we consider as kind of the heyday of good health care and pensions, a huge percentage of the American working class never had health care and never had pensions because they didn't work for strong unionized employers.
In the backward
And we never got it as a
right.
general right.
And the backward union leaders, I remember, would say, when I'd tell them in 1975, we should be fighting for national health service, health care for all, you know what they'd say? Well, you know what, Ed? They'll never join the union then. That's why they should join the union.
Right.
You know, it's that business mentality. That,
Right,
the
but that wasn't the mentality prior
Right.
to.
Right.
And the turning point really happened in the late 40s.
Yeah.
After the Taft-Hartley Act was passed, it included this provision that said, any union that won't sign affidavits that all their officers are not communists cannot use the National Labor Relations Board. Everyone said they wouldn't sign it, but then they started signing it. And the auto workers went and signed these affidavits, and then they started raiding UE. And they started stealing members from us and filing petitions for elections at shops. And because we hadn't signed the affidavits, we couldn't be on the ballot, so they'd win by default. So after this went on for a few months, the UE demanded that the CIO, since we were paying dues to the CIO, the auto workers were paying dues to the CIO. The CIO Constitution says one union will not raid another. Well, they're violating the Constitution. Will you please stop them, Mr. Murray, from raiding us? Philip Murray wouldn't do anything. And UE actually, that was what led to the UE leaving the CIO, was if the CIO is going to raid us, why should we pay dues to an organization that's trying to destroy us? And then in the wake of that, the CIO chartered, they got the ex-president of the UE who'd been thrown out for incompetence, and gave him, one man, a charter for a new union, the IUE. And then with the help of the companies, because the Taft-Hartley Act had another weird provision. Because under the Wagner Act, only if you get 30% of the workers to sign cards or a petition can you get an election to represent workers in that workplace. The Taft-Hartley Act said, oh no, the employer can do that too. So because the IUE had no organizational structure at all, but was trying to raid us, they had no way of stealing our members in GE and Westinghouse, except that GE and Westinghouse did it for them. So both Westinghouse and GE petitioned the government to hold elections in their plants And in 1950, they had national elections in every GE plant and every Westinghouse plant, with all the structure of the government and the CIO and the employers all ganged up against UE. We lost about half of those elections. One of them that we lost, and really was a major blow to us in the Pittsburgh area, our biggest shop in the Pittsburgh area, the first local we had in the Pittsburgh area, Local 601 in East Pittsburgh at Westinghouse. And through the efforts of the company and through the efforts of a Catholic priest named Father Rice, who was a vicious red baiter, we lost Westinghouse East Pittsburgh and many other shops. And so that was the beginning of the battles we went through for the next 10 years. But 45 to 50 is like a major turning point where in 45, 46, we had all this stuff on the table, national health care, national pension system through Social Security. The labor movement was united around this aggressive program. Within 2 years, the labor movement was split and everyone was cutting deals to get along with the boss and go along with the Cold War. So anyway, I'll stop at that point.
Well, you weren't kidding when you said IUE was an imitation.
Yeah. Oh, I could tell you, I could go on for hours about how there's still an imitation.
Well, that was a great presentation. Thoroughly. Last but not least, I got to introduce Colleen Evans, who's local president of 2028 American Federation of Government Employees, representing over 2,000 employees at the VA hospital. It's also an organization that I've been affiliated with, and she has my sympathy because it's a horrible union.
It is. It's not lying.
I'm telling you, they still have an anti-communist clause. I haven't seen it enforced, but you know about the case where they went after one of a local president in Washington for communist activity or being a communist or membership in the Communist Party or whatever, which I don't even know exists anymore. But in any case, they will come after officers who struggle against the agency or the union, the leadership of the union, and they have done so, and we've both been victims of that. And so, Colleen, you can talk to us about your experiences.
Well, mine will be very brief. I don't even come close to the vast knowledge and experience that my two counterparts have. I'm a nurse at the VA hospital, and I have about 30-plus years experience. And the way I got involved in the union was there's 3 hospitals in Pittsburgh, 3 VA hospitals. And I worked in the psychiatric hospital over at Highland Drive. And what happened is they decided that they were going to close the hospital and merge them because they decided while we were in the middle of the Iraq War, going into the Afghanistan War, that we really didn't need all these hospitals for veterans care. However, that was at the height of all of these veterans coming back with what we label invisible wounds of war. And we've had a lot of men and women that have been coming back with PTSD, severe depression, drug and alcohol abuse, and never was there more of an important time to keep the psychiatric hospitals open. However, what they did, and I think what I hope that I can convey is the VA is like a microcosm of what our government is now. We see, at least I'm seeing what they do with the VA throughout the government with different things. They set it up to fail, or they set it up that you have to close certain things. So what happened with our hospital is that they let things go, or they didn't take care of the buildings, and they were falling down and they were falling apart, so they had to close them. So we were on 168 acres of land, And they closed that hospital and moved us to Oakland on 13 acres of land. So now that's vacant, so they can sell it or do whatever. What I found throughout my time when I was president is I met Bob, and he made me active, unfortunately. So during this activism, what we found out is that our own union, we're the American Federation of Government Employees, AFGE, and they are very much into being partners with management. And we don't have the same interests. You know, management's interest is, to produce as much as they can with the least amount of money. And our interest is fair wages for fair work. And the two just are not compatible. So they have we have these like partnerships supposedly. And they want us to buy into whatever the latest gimmick is that they have, that they need to do. We did not agree with most of the things that they wanted to do, and became the targets, I guess you could say. So the more we fought against things, the more that we were harassed, the more we were investigated. They reported us to the Department of Labor, to who do they report us to?
Special Counsel,
Office of Special Counsel.
Inspector General,
The Inspector General's office.
Administrative Investigative Board.
Yeah. And so I was suspended twice for trumped-up charges. But long story short, what I found happening is that the government does things where they name, how can I say this? We have what you call compensation and pension exams, and it's for our veterans that are coming back. They have to be they have to go through exams to find out whatever ailments they had in war. They come back to see, like, should you be compensated for it or not? And so what they ended up doing is saying that we needed to start outsourcing a lot of the work because we weren't able to get enough done. And the secretary of the VA at the time was Secretary Principi, and he had to go, you have to ask for the budget. So he would go before Congress and request what kind of budget he needed, and did not ask for enough. So it ended up with these exams. We did not have enough staffing for it, so they basically had no choice but to privatize and outsource the care. So it ends up happening that the company, the QTC company that they outsourced all the care to, was the Secretary's company, QTC. So the exams that we would do that may cost, $183 for the exam, it costs 3 times that much for the company that they've now outsourced it to. And more we're seeing that they are outsourcing more and more of our jobs. And then what they ended up doing now is that they go after the vulnerable, or those that have the harder time to fight or whatever. So now they're focusing on to outsource the housekeepers. All of our housekeepers are veterans. So while they're out there talking about how they have to, be conservative with their money and make sure that everything is cost contained, they actually are focusing on getting rid of the jobs for the very people that were there to serve, the veterans. And, you know, that's why we're so against this, like, public-private partnership, because there's a book out, it's very old, I think he might have written it in the 80s, from Paul C. Light, about the shadow government. And there is more government employees that are outsourced than there are actually government employees, because of all the privatizing.
He wrote that in the 90s,
Was it in the 90s?
after Clinton outsourced 426,000 federal jobs.
How many?
426,000.
26,000.
Him and Al Gore, they reinvented government, remember that? They reinvented on our backs.
Yeah.
And it just didn't reach, private sector goons as he sold off government assets.
Yeah, so they said, you know, we've been right-sized, downsized, outsourced, reinvented. We've just seen one job after the other being lost. And then what they're doing now is, you know, pretty much what's been going on is, I'm sure anybody that watches the news, they've demonized the federal employees. I think anybody that sees us now just thinks that that all we do is sit in a corner and, you know, smoke cigarettes and eat as much food as we possibly can, and certainly don't do our job. So there's a lot of corruption because management has a lot of power. And if and it's been exposed. I don't know if you've seen, you know, in the past year or so with all the problems in the VA with the Legionella. And well, what happened is that the director of the hospital, he was actually a visiting director. Our hospital has 10 other hospitals within the region, and so he was the director of all of them. Well, they get awards and bonuses for, you know, all these wonderful things they do. And so he was up for this presidential award where he received $63,000 bonus. In the meantime, there was a problem with, he had fired the people responsible for maintaining it was copper silver ionization to keep Legionella under control. Well, he fired them and then never had anyone else replaced that knew how to run the whole program. So it did fail. So what he ended up doing was when we started having a Legionella issue, he hid it from everybody in the hospital. We didn't know this was going on. And he didn't want anyone to know because he wanted to get his bonus. And so what ended up happening in Congress is they had hearings about it so that they could expose how horrible the VA employees were and how all these actions, these employees they're not responsible for their jobs, and you know, we need to make them accountable and they need to be fired. And it was really all of management because there is no accountability to them. There is, you know, all the structures are in place for, you know, if you don't do your job, you know, you're accountable for it. But so what they're doing now is they have these bills that come out, and they put out these acronyms so that they sound like they're so positive and they're very helpful for you. When they were downsizing our hospital, the psych hospital, they called it the CARES program. Capital Asset for Realignment Enhanced Services. And it was supposed to be, you know, to get rid of the unused buildings that we didn't need and et cetera. And now what they're doing is they have a bill that's out there that's called the Veterans Protection Bill. And that bill is to eliminate official time for union officials so that we can't do our job. So when you hear this bill, it's like veteran protection. Now we have to protect the veterans against the unionists because, you know, my God, what are we going to do? So now that they're going after the official time, what they're going to do, like I'm a nurse, so now they want to make sure that we really don't have much official time. So they're going to say that anybody that is a professional nurse, doctor, pharmacist. They cannot have any official time to represent anybody. And they want to, in this bill, decrease the official time for others to be no more than 25% of your time. Are you a closed shop? Your union, is it a closed shop?
Some of them are, most of them, but not all of them. We have a lot of different shops, of course.
Yeah, so ours, we have to represent all of the bargaining unit employees. It's not a closed shop. People pay dues. And so the way that it works now is their dues are just automatically deducted from their paycheck when they sign up and join the union. We represent everybody. We have about half the members that pay dues, but we represent all of the members. So with this bill, the other thing they want to do is no longer have the dues automatically deducted from the pay. They want us to have to go to the membership every 2 weeks to ask them, can you pay us the dues now? Which basically is just going to destroy the union, because there's no way you're going to be able to survive that. And that bill is out right now. It's S1094. Or no, that one is HR 1461. They just passed this accountability bill, which we call the firing bill, and that is S1094. And what that bill is doing is, the way it had been, if you were charged with misconduct or whatever, and then we had to go to arbitration, you have to show by preponderance of the evidence that this person did commit this or whatever. Well, now this bill that they just passed, it will be just by substantial evidence, which pretty much means whatever. It's not a very high bar to meet to fire anybody, and they've decreased the amount of time to have due process, so we will only have like 15 days to respond to any kind of charges against you. Then, when you go before a judge, arbitrator, or Merit System Protection Board, MSPB, it had been that you could bring your case forward and the judge could uphold the charges, dismiss the charges, or mitigate whatever was done. With this bill now, they've stripped that away from the judge, that he can only either uphold or dismiss the charges, which means that they're going to uphold everything because, usually they're mitigated. And then this is just another way of how they are coming after the employees and pretty much stripping you of any right you have, because if you're not perfect, you're out of there. Right now, we have, when new people come in, you have a year that's like your probationary period, where pretty much they can fire you at will within that time for anything you may have done wrong. So with this bill that came out, they want to give the sole authority to the Secretary of the VA, and then what he can do is decide if he wants to, after 8 months, keep you on probationary status or let you become a career employee. And if it's up to him, he can just decide, I'm going to keep you a probationary employee forever. So we become at-will employees because we will never, have any kind of protection. As far as some of the things that, when we first got involved in this, that we found that really helped us was we went to all the veteran service organizations, the VSOs, and introduced ourselves and asked to start a coalition together to try to work together, because they were going after the veterans through the employees, because all the things that they're doing to get the employees is harming the veterans. And the VSO saw that. So, and Bob was was a spearheading part of this. We created this group called COVA, Coalition of Veteran Advocates, which I would say was probably one of the strongest things we ever did to combat a lot of the attacks that we've had. When they were talking about the different issues within their locals, what we found out with the national local, and the problem with this, our federal local, and being partners, is that they've become careerists. They're more interested in getting through their career and going along with whatever management wants to do than actually fighting for the members and pushing, our issues out there, or, helping us, so that they cave in to a lot of whatever the managers do, because they say, well, I'll get an extra boost in my salary now, and the next thing you know, you've lost another right. What else could I say, Bob?
Still 45,000 staff short.
Yeah. We have 22 veterans a day that commit suicide, but the VA, like you said, remains with 45,000 staff short.
Shulkin wants to close 1,100 buildings. He wants a double-digit increase in the amount of work they contract out, despite the fact that they got an increase in their budget, their proposed budget.
And they're also out there, they're reclassifying jobs because they're trying to downgrade all of the jobs. I think there's 7 different classifications they've gone out to downgrade. One of the things they had was called National Security Personnel System, and this was in the Department of Defense. And they went after them. They wanted to start. What was that? That they're.
They were saying that your participation and membership in the union was a conflict of interest, and therefore you couldn't support or work in the Department of Defense, and that they had hoped to get this through and then to extend it to other agencies.
So
the question then is, what is the union reaction to all this? Are they fighting it, or are they just going along with it, and how?
they're trying to. So basically, their answer is, let's organize. Let's try to get more members. Let's try to contribute to, campaign so that we can elect more Clintons. They're doing absolutely everything they shouldn't be doing,
And are the members becoming more angry with the union, or are they becoming more angry with the federal government, or are they disillusioned?
They're disillusioned, they're apathetic, they're, and they're uneducated. Because there's no true education coming out of there to explain to them what's really going on until the last minute.
Yeah.
Like now, when they have the bills out there, then they start educating everybody. Well, by then, nobody's been out there,
Right.
talking to their congressmen or senators, or petitioning, or having rallies, or.
So people don't see the union as a vehicle to fight this.
Right, right.
And it ought to be a public fight, because
Right.
this is your public employees.
Right.
This is government, to me, this is part of what's wrong with the quote-unquote resistance to Trump. It's all about, he's a traitor, his staff met with the Russians. This is the only thing we need to worry about, is that Trump commit treason, and meanwhile, he's robbing us blind at every frickin' level, including the rights of, federal employees to unions, and nobody even notices it. All the liberals are focused on, but what about, what did Comey say at dinner, and what did Trump say at dinner, and who met with the Russian ambassador when, and, this is, it almost seems like it's a deliberate diversion to have us all looking the other way, while the Trump administration and the Republicans in Congress.
But in this situation, the union has the table set for them. They have the opportunity to make the issue, yet they, like you said, they refuse to do it, except in the most muted, minuscule, picayune fashion, which the members are never going to enable them in, identify with any fight, because there is no fight.
And so now, they're trying to get all the different members to, call your congressman or call your senators. However, they have been so out of touch with all the members that most of them, they're not even paying attention to them. They don't even understand how serious this is. Because, it starts here, they're focusing on this one federal facility, the VA, or entity. And then it'll go to the next federal, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, Social Security, and they're just picking them off one by one by one.
Which gets back to that whole thing that unless there's a national focus, a reorientation of the whole issue on a class basis, and like whether it's education or So I mean,
It ought to be easy, because this people. I mean, there's tremendous public support for veterans, for not screwing the veterans, and it doesn't take a whole lot to explain to people that this attack on your union is an attack on veterans.
On the veterans, right.
Yeah, well, despite all the flag waving and all that kind of stuff, they've gone after veterans, they've gone after disabled veterans. I mean, they have no. They closed our laundry, which was staffed by 50% disabled veterans, combat disabled veterans, and
Well, this idea of contracting out the lowest paid people and, who are veterans, and, again, it's like you have the issues right there. The real question then is, because there's no internal leadership inside that union, the union is able to, because they're afraid of fighting the company, which is the government and the politicians, so they just, everything sinks to a lower level. And unless there's some uprising with a clear identity, it's going to continue. It's just going to continue. I'll give you other examples, like we say that people won't join the union. Well, we had a strike in Wilkes-Barre for 2 years. The union had to collect dues. For 2 years, we had to collect dues by hand from the members. And we still had 85% of the people pay dues, because the union had an identity with the members, and they knew they were in a fight. So, in the old days, in this, which we didn't talk about in the CIO, they would stand in front of the plants and they would collect dues from people. That's how because people paid dues voluntarily. There was no dues
Or
check.
the stop steward had to go around every week
Exactly,
and get people pay dues. And I've had old timers in writing to tell me, we actually lost something when we got dues check off.
Yeah.
Because the direct contract between the stewards and the members declined, because you didn't have to go collect dues anymore.
See, I've never seen that.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I joined the AFG 2 years ago, and I've never heard from anybody. And surprisingly, and just a question, hasn't the AFG just grown the last 2 years? One of the few unions has actually added members?
Yeah, well, they're very focused on organizing.
Yeah.
Right.
But if they say organizing to them, it's just like I call them, when the old days we would say, do you want to really have a union, or do you want to become a dues collection agency?
Right.
They're just collecting dues.
Right.
But they don't do anything.
That's what they're doing.
They're just collecting dues, and the whole function of the union is to make sure they have a revenue but there's no program, there's no fight. And as I said, in the other places where you tell the members, here's what we're doing, why you should pay your dues, eventually they will get it. But you can't do that unless you have a fighting union.
Right.
And
Right.
you had some, if we were a closed shop in GE, which is where I worked, and still our largest employer, we didn't get union shop, where everyone has to join the union, until the 80s. But when I worked at the Erie plant, my local had like 95% membership.
Wow.
When it was an open shop. The other local, the salary local, had about 30% membership. And then in the 1970s, and the local was mostly women, but the leadership were men, and they weren't doing anything. They had like an infusion of new people. They had 2 major strikes over equal pay for women, and after a couple of years, their membership went from 30% of the bargaining unit to 80% of the bargaining unit. Because when people see the union is fighting,
Right.
they want to be part of it. When people think the union isn't doing a damn thing,
Right.
and if they have a choice of joining or not,
Not, they're
they
right.
chose not to join because
Right.
they didn't see anything going on. So that's really the crucial difference.
Well, let's get some comments and
Yeah.
questions from the audience.
There's power in the factory, power in the land, power in the hand of the worker. But it all amounts to nothing if together we don't stand there.